All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to this lunchtime edition of the DC Scrum User Group. My name is Fadi Stefan. I'm going to be your host for today. As always, we're here to connect, share, and learn about all things Agile and Scrum. All right, I'm going to do two quick announcements before we get started. First off, I'd like to thank our sponsors as usual, Excella Consulting and Kaizen Co. If you need any help with Agile training or coaching, please reach out and I'll connect you and we'll see how we can help each other. If you've missed any of our previous talks, you can follow at Kaizen Co. to find out about all the previous talks and any of the events that are happening, or you can go to wdcsog.com and see all of our previous talks. Next month, April 19th, we are going to have Michael Sahota present on Loss in Translation, the manager's role in Agile, right? So when you're adopting or transitioning to Agile, what happens to the manager's role? I hope you can join us for that session. Today, we have Julie Wyman talking to us about Agile lessons from Antarctica. Julie is a certified Agile coach with Excella. She has over 12 years of experience in Agile software development, as well as traditional project management. She's worked in government like DHS and DOJ, and also in commercials and nonprofits at Reuters and Caterpillar. I'm glad Julie's able to join us today, and I'm eager to hear what kind of lessons she learned from her trip to Antarctica. Julie, I'm going to pass it back to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Fadi. I'm really happy to be here and participating with our DC Scrum user group. Going to go ahead and share my screen. So give me a moment to do that and get set up here.
It's good.
Okay. All right. So as Fadi said, talk today, the session focuses on some Agile lessons that I picked up along a trip I took a couple of years ago to Antarctica. Now, the Agile Manifesto isn't new. I'm guessing that most of the people that are choosing to attend today are already bought into responding to change over following a plan. So the main objective of this session is just to highlight how experiences outside of software development can really help us to reinforce this mindset, and perhaps how we can pull lessons and tips from these experiences to increase our empathy for dynamic situations. So as Fadi said, my name is Julie Wyman. I'm an Agile coach and fellow at Excella, so I am based in the DC area. Been working in Agile environments for over a decade now, utilizing a variety of different frameworks and approaches, but I have a big interest in traveling, although I haven't been doing much of that for the last year, obviously. But when I'm not traveling, I'm cheering on the Green Bay Packers and watching a lot of the Great British Bake Off, which I've definitely been doing more of in the past year. So to get us kicked off for this session, I'm actually going to ask you guys to use a tool called Mentimeter. So for this, you can go ahead and grab your smartphone, or if you don't want to use your phone, you can use any computer or laptop and just go into your browser and go ahead and just go to www.menti.com. And if you go in that way, it'll just prompt you to enter a code. And if you do that, go ahead and just enter the code that you see on the screen. It's 949310. And we're going to use this just because I want to add a little question to you, just to get our juices flowing, to get us started for the session. Or if you want, you can snap the QR code and that'll bring the question up for you as well. So again, it's just www.menti.com. And then you enter in that code 949310. And if you do that, then what you should see is this question prompt here, which is, what emotions or adjectives come to mind when you think about change? So I'm going to give you guys a moment, and you can enter a couple, you can enter the first one that comes to mind, and go ahead and just submit your responses, and then we should see them pop up on the screen here. see some popping up, and we'll see more as more people have a chance to get in. And again, if you missed it, it should be showing here on the top of the screen if you missed it. So it's here, www.menti.com, 949310. So I'm seeing more of them come in, and we'll just give it another minute to see some more. Yeah, and what's always interesting to me is it's a hodgepodge, right? It's really this mix of words. You see right together in the middle, excitement, challenge, anxiety, opportunity, and stress. So this real mix of positive and somewhat negative words: questioning, unknown, necessary, apprehension, metamorphosis, optimism, excited, happy, question, growth, questioning, apprehension, discomfort, transition, challenge. So it's a real mix. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead. I'm gonna ask you to do one more. So I'm gonna ask you the same question, but this time, answer it if you think about planning. What emotions or adjectives come to mind when you think about planning? So you should be able to be in the same Menti. It should prompt you to progress to the next slide, or you may just be able to refresh, but then you'll be prompted to enter new responses. Okay, so seeing some answers come in here: timelines, detail, risk management, purpose, dependencies, intentional, uncertainty, coordination, objectives, knowledge, brainstorm, people, boring, research, anxiety still. So there's some overlap between some of the change ones. Some excitement, roadmap, strategy, organized, calculate, more borings popping up a little bit more, roadmap, structure. Yeah. Some excitement, tools, objectives, meetings, goals. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you guys. Yeah. So I'm going to switch back over to presentation. Just give me a moment to get back into the full screen view here. So thank you for doing that. I wanted us to just start thinking about both of these concepts in tandem. There is certainly no shortage of quotes about the need for planning and the constancy of change. And I do think it's a common misconception that there's no need to plan in Agile, that it's all just about go with the flow. But of course, that's not the case. And in fact, there's guidance directly in the Agile Manifesto itself. We know that responding to change over following a plan is directly called out. But what always strikes me is that too often people forget this last line included, which highlights the necessity for both items, but in the right amounts and in the right way. And it doesn't actually say anything about not making a plan. It just says not to continue to follow it when circumstances have changed. And that need to balance both planning and responding to change really resonates with me. There's a large part of my personality that definitely enjoys making a good old plan and is then ready to march out and check off those action items. But through many, many life experiences, I have also come to appreciate that there is just no amount of planning in the world that is perfect enough to prevent you from taking a good old face plant every once in a while. and that on those occasions, you just have to adjust and find a new way forward. So although I know it's still necessary to plan in agile environments, I think the specific approaches to planning do change from big upfront design to a just enough approach. And with just enough, we're planning in more detail for that smaller time horizon and not trying to get very specific for items that are much further out. And I think the right amount of planning still has great value. That collaborative planning process can really spur discussions that lead to new discoveries and improve understanding across a whole team. It can provide us with a clearer sense of our true goal. I really like the commander's intent concept. This idea that it's a definition and description of what a successful operation will yield. And a good commander's intent will allow employees and teams to adapt the plan using improvisation, initiative, and adaptation to reach the original plan objectives. So that's kind of how I think about this just enough planning. So in most agile environments, we accept that many things will change and we'll need to be able to remain flexible in order to respond to them. So if we planned well, we'll be able to go into those changes with a clear sense of our goal and how we can still achieve it under the new circumstances. I know for me, there are a couple of work examples that come to mind, right? We try to go ahead and set some release goals, but the actual features, the specific user stories or exact acceptance criteria that we may end up implementing often change, but those release goals still provide us a key guiding focus for our teams in our program. And so our product owner is defining the what, but we often have to adjust the exact how of how we're going to meet those needs. So knowing that we're going to have to adapt the approach is nowhere is this more true than in. So let me tell you a little bit about planning and change in the context of an Antarctic cruise. And along the way, I'm going to be calling out 6 key takeaways about both planning and change. All right, so I'm going to start with planning in the context of an Antarctic cruise. So our expedition leader started off by telling everyone on board all the many reasons why her team spent a lot of time planning. The first one was to minimize emergencies due to the fact that we were in a very remote location. Second was that there are a lot of environmental regulations to be mindful of. And third was that they really wanted to maximize passenger safety and experience, and that was really at the top of their list. So I mentioned that we were very remote. And so because of that, you want to minimize those emergencies, especially anything medical related. So the trip that I took, we happened to take a flight from Punta Arenas, Chile, and then we landed, and then from there we were on a ship and we were cruising around and making landings all around the Antarctic Peninsula. But this flight, as you'll later come to appreciate, is not the easiest thing to begin with, and you are very remote. And so once you're there, it's not as simple as just popping over to a Walgreens if you need some extra supplies. There's no urgent care clinic right there. And so you really need to be mindful of your remote location. Environmental protection. There's a lot of planning that goes into this. Antarctica is remote, and the organisms that live there are not used to coming in contact with lots of tourists all the time. And so to protect them and their environment and the fact that it's their home, we had all these different guidance that we had to follow. We had to stay to our path and not, go through their habitat. We had to keep a certain distance. We had to make sure that when we made holes by walking, we filled them in so that they didn't fall into them and get trapped. We had to make sure that when we left the ship, we actually sanitized our boots so that we didn't bring anything onto their soil. So there were a lot of things that we had to follow and planning that went into making sure that we were following the right protocols. And finally, planning is really important when you are about to take a bunch of passengers out to go exploring somewhere as unique as Antarctica. The picture that I'm sharing right now is of Portal Point. It was our first continental landing during the trip. And planning is really critical because this beautiful and pristine snow that was falling on that day is not just covering hills, it is also covering really deep crevices. And the mountain guides go out ahead of time And so they lay a trail and they know exactly where these are. So they're protecting us. So you really need to stick to that trail so that you don't fall into anything. And as someone who stepped off I will promise you, only 1 foot off the trail to take a photo while somebody passed behind me, I ended up thigh deep in the snow just in a matter of seconds. And then they had to pull me out of the snow. Now, that wasn't a crevice. It was just not very deep packed snow, but you get my drift. You have to be super, super careful. So safety is also really important in terms of how close we got to any glaciers or snow drifts, and in terms of how you got into or out of these Zodiacs, these little rubber Pontiacs that we used for cruising around when we were on the water and looking at the ice. Because again, if you are remote and you can't just get quick medical attention, you want to make sure that you're being super careful. But also from the passenger experience side, lots of planning went into being able to help us have the best possible experience, see the most things, experience the most that we absolutely could on our trip. And every day the expedition team spent lots of time planning our excursions. There were lots of factors to coordinate, and they needed these plans to ensure that everything went smoothly. Ensuring that 100+ passengers were able to get on and off the ship is critical. And so they had a disembarkation group, and these groups were how they made sure that people came off, not all 100 passengers at one time, but in an orderly fashion. And they had a sign in and sign out sheet. So since there is no running to the nearest store, you also have to make sure that you're bringing the right gear with you and that you have the right gear for the environment. And planning is a critical aspect of that. So here's where the right level of planning ahead with your clothing choice can actually make it easier to respond to the changing weather conditions later. But you cannot bring any extra stuff. The planes that we were flying in on were only actually about half full. We actually had to take 2 planes, each only half full. And this is because when they landed, there was a very, very short landing strip, and the planes needed to be able to slow down quickly enough that they didn't run off of them. So everything, ourselves and our luggage, had to get weighed down exactly to the pound so that the pilots knew what the total weights were. So this planning was incredibly important. So you had to have all the right gear, but nothing extra. And so you wanted to make sure that you had exactly what you needed for constantly changing weather conditions. So this is an example of us being all geared up and ready to go. But one of the fun things about these yellow jackets that they gave us is that they were actually designed to anticipate changing temperatures. And so they could be taken off and actually worn as a backpack. You may think, why would you be taking your coat off if you're in Antarctica? Isn't it freezing? Well, we were actually visiting in early January, which is their summer. And on a nice day with the sun out, when you're hiking around, you can actually get quite warm. And so they knew that people may actually want to take off their jackets. But if you do that and you just toss it on the ground, your jacket may land in some penguin poop, which is quite smelly and will stink up your cabin. So to help you not do that, they designed these jackets to be able to be turned inside out, to have straps in them that you could then wear as a backpack and carry your jacket with you, but without it making you so warm. So again, planning, but helping you anticipate changes that may come. So this brings us to my first couple trip takeaways. The first one being that planning is absolutely still necessary. And the second one being that the right planning can make it easier to respond to change. So let's talk about some of that change. During that first briefing aboard our ship, it was all about expectation setting. The expedition leader didn't just let us know all the planning that they did, but she also let us know about the process she'd used to make decisions on how she would keep us informed when things changed. And she also tried to prepare us for the fact that things would change and frequently, that there were many, many reasons why things would change when you're in Antarctica, that there were forces outside of our control, most of them being weather, fog, wave surges near hurricane force winds, newly discovered information, some things like animal sightings, military exercises occurring nearby, all different things that could warrant a change in our plans. And so most of the adjustments that we would make would involve specifics of how we were going to accomplish one of our goals, but not necessarily a wholesale change to the goals themselves. Because clearly, these conditions will allow us to have different opportunities and may necessitate a change of our plans for the day. And you can actually see some clues baked right into this plan that I had shown you before about how things may still be changing. This was that plan that they had shared with us from our landing at Portal Point. And you can see they said, well, we hope that we are going to land at Portal Point. This will be our first attempt at landing on the continent. And it's our aim to do a Zodiac cruise. So they are very much expectation setting up front. And they're doing this continuously. And it really helped to ensure that everyone was on the same page and prepared for what might occur. And then there was a lot of contingency planning that was also provided. And the team was giving more options about what they could do if we did have to make some changes along the way. And I think that this was definitely true on the trip. They did a really good job of it, but it gets me thinking about when and how this could apply at work and how we can do a better job of setting expectations as well. So again, just because they had plans in place and they were really solid and they were based on all their previous experiences doesn't mean that they didn't have to go out and verify them and make sure they still made sense. Sometimes the plans that they would have had were only a week old. They had done this trip with another group of passengers just the prior week, but they still had to send a mountain guide out to test the route again and adjust if necessary. And so, oftentimes that meant they did actually have to make changes. And then the route we took wasn't the most direct one. So to us, it didn't look the most obvious, but it was the safest. And that was what they had to do given the current environment and the factors at hand. So that brings me to my third trip takeaway, which is to set expectations early and often. And as a 2020 life example, now extending into 2021, this takeaway really makes me think a lot about the communications that the company I work for has been providing lately about our potential return to work options. And it really helps me appreciate how they've been communicating frequently and well in advance of any changes, knowing how much this will mean to people. And so I'm seeing that as a work example of setting expectations early and often. All right, so I'm going to walk you through just an entire one day of an ever-changing day in Antarctica, both from our planning and change perspective. So as I said, we typically had a daily goal in mind. That was kind of our focus. And so on this particular day, our goal was to see a colony of Gen 2 penguins. So quick little pop quiz. Let's find out who knows their penguins. So go ahead and pop back into the Menti. You can use the same code. So again, it's www.menti.com. And then the code is 949310. I'm going to refresh the page. And then I'm going to ask you to tell me who can identify which of these three penguins is the Gen 2. Is it A, B, or C? So we'll just go ahead and move to the next one here. I will say that the photo you're seeing on the screen is just like a cropped preview image. It is not giving you the answer. So the fact that on the screen it's showing B right now, that is not necessarily any clue. Could be, but it's not the answer. Oh man, guys are just all across the board. 5, 5, 5. Okay, well, some people definitely got it right, but some people definitely got it wrong. So everybody's going to learn something. All right. Well, I will tell you. I'm going to switch back over. Okay, so the answer is A. A is the Gen 2 penguin. A is the Gen 2. The Gen 2 is the one that has the red-orange beak. B was the chin strap penguin. That makes sense. They have that little chin strap. And then the third one was the Adelie penguin. They have the full black head and black beak. So everyone learned a little bit more about penguins. But on this particular day, again, our goal was to see a colony of Gen 2 penguins. So the night before, the expedition team briefed us on their very carefully prepared plan. It was based on all of their knowledge of the best viewing spots in the area. It took into account the expected weather conditions. We'll go ahead and call that Plan A. So Plan A lasted until Plan B was announced during the morning wake-up call. We were just a little bit behind schedule, so disembarkation times were pushed by half an hour. So not that big of a deal. So we're going ahead, eating breakfast, assuming we had Plan B, but then Plan C arrived, and it turned out that our first choice landing spot just was not going to work. The wave surge was too high. It was going to make for a dangerous landing because we have to take those zodiacs from the ship to actually land, and we just weren't going to be able to do it. So instead, we had to go around the corner of the peninsula, and we were going to try to land there instead. So that brings me to my next takeaway, which is try to keep the goal in mind and then adapt the approach that you take to get there as needed. So success. We did that. We kept the goal in mind, which is find that Gen 2 penguin colony, adapt our approach. We did that. We just found a different landing spot, and we did it. We found this beautiful colony of Gen 2s, pristine, and then just walked a little further, and there's even more of them. So tons. Very cool to see. I actually saw lots of penguins waddling around, which is, I guess, what I expected, but was, of course, very cute. It's always fun to see a penguin waddle. But then I unexpectedly learned that penguins also travel this way. Because why waddle when you can just slide down a hill? And that was pretty fun. And after all of this, per our plan, we headed out for a quick little Zodiac cruise because it's nice to be able to see some ice, see if you can spot anything. So we were almost done with our cruise when someone spotted off in the distance a whale tail. And then we seized that opportunity and embarked on an ad hoc Plan D, which was an extended Zodiac cruise to try to check out those whales up close. So in this case, extending the cruise was a bonus. But in other cases, it might have meant not landing where we intended and entirely forgoing a planned activity so that we could go and do something else, which may actually be worth it in order to seize that new unforeseen activity. So I think in work, mostly what we are doing is tweaking and adjusting our plans, but occasionally it does make sense to entirely shift. Sometimes there's enough of a drastic change in market that it makes sense to make a more drastic shift. There is a noteworthy Antarctic example as well of having to respond more drastically to change, and that is Ernest Shackleton's voyage on the vessel Endurance. So he had an original goal, which was to transverse the Antarctic continent, starting from the side of the Weddell Sea. Turn by turn, events unfolded, and it turned out that he had to change and adapt his plan and tactics. He at first thought that they would be able to just changed their approach. His ship initially got stuck in some ice, but they thought, that's okay. This happens sometimes. We will just float with the ice and we'll just float along. And when we're able to get free, we will continue on. So that was, again, a change in approach, but not a change in goal. But at some point, it became obvious that the ship would not get unstuck from the ice. In fact, the ice cracked and broke the ship. And so at that point in time, they actually had to wholesale change their goal and not just their approach. So now their new goal became the survival of the crew. So through a continuous adaptation, they had to devise a whole new plan. It actually took multiple attempts, but they were eventually able to come back for the rest of the crew, rescue everyone, which was amazing. And obviously by then, that was a much more important accomplishment than their original goal. So that was my fifth trip takeaway, which is when circumstances necessitate, change the actual goal. Back when I gave this talk for the first time in February of 2020, the last time that I had traveled to a conference pre-COVID-19, I thought takeaway number 5 seemed relevant. I captured it as a trip takeaway, but I didn't think it would be as common as the others. Since then, a global pandemic has obviously provided lots of examples of this one, of actually needing to change your goals. So it serves as a good reminder to not steadfastly stick to plans that just don't make sense anymore. And this takes me to my last and 6th takeaway from this trip, which was an increased sense of empathy for team members struggling with dynamic situations. Even though regular replanning had become the norm on this trip, and we often had plans A through D, sometimes E, F, and G, it doesn't mean it was a natural fit for every passenger's personality. And observing their difficulties and experiencing my own gave me more empathy for team members struggling with changing plans. So on January 7th, we were scheduled to depart Antarctica and get our flight back to Chile. We tried to leave all day. That was normal. We spent most of the day in this room since they were starting to clean our cabins out for the next set of passengers. And multiple times we started to get all dressed, trek down to leave, only to get called back at the last minute. This is not atypical. The weather varies, and so it often takes a while to find a good weather window for a flight to be able to take off. Finally, we thought we got the call to disembark, so we took our goodbye selfie and we were heading out. But we only made it all the way to our landing spot for the plane to hear that our plane had turned back mid-flight because it would not be able to land with this set of clouds that had rolled in. And so, although the plane had left with a good plan and the best available info at the time, it had to respond to change in the weather as it unfolded for the safety of all involved. That's okay. We spent most of the next day back in the waiting game. Spirits were relatively high at first. But it didn't take off the next day, and it was not so hard to see why. We looked out our windows, and you just could not see anything. Luckily, we had plenty of supplies. We weren't in any danger of ourselves. But I had a lot of empathy at that time for the passengers on the next trip, whose trip actually got canceled, likely after they'd been planning for this trip for over a year, since that's usually when you have to book trips to Antarctica. And then those clouds hung around for day after day after day. And even though our plans had to keep changing, and it was due to safety, it didn't mean it was easy. I myself was starting to get really anxious because they started to talk about that we might have to sail all the way back instead of flying back as planned. And that anxiety was real for me because I had purposefully selected this trip where you got to fly from Chile because I had serious motion sickness in the past, and I did not want to cross the Drake Passage on the boat. So for me, this shift made me think about previous times that we'd rolled out guidance and changes for my teams. And even though teams knew that we had to make those shifts, it was still really hard for them. And so it gives me a good reminder to give people enough space to really process that info, even if it seems obvious that we have no choice but to roll with it. So finally, it seemed to us at least that the weather had changed. We had seen the sun, and surely we would get out now. But it wasn't up to us. There were a lot of other factors involved. The fog had lifted, but it had gotten colder, and potentially now the runway was actually going to be more icy. So the decision of whether we could fly or not was just not in our control. But the decision of whether we would sail back was, and we could not indefinitely stick to the original plan of flying back. Some people were starting to run out of critical medications. People were expected back at work. The ship was expected for its next trip. We would eventually run out of supplies. So the expectations were set that if we couldn't leave by midnight of next day, we would instead have to sail back to Argentina and return that way. So even in this situation, the crew did the absolute best they could to manage expectations. They reached out to passengers who they knew might be anxious, and they let them talk to the captain and the ship's doctor ahead of time to walk them through what they would do to make the situation the best that they could. So remember, we were supposed to depart on January 7th, and instead we hung around and took lots more excursions, but we did finally make it out on January 13th at 11:30 p.m., just in time to avoid having to sail all the way back. So in this context, all of the planning and the replanning did not feel like wasted effort and rework. It really did seem like it was just a necessary fact of the environment. But what struck me is that in reality, most of my work situations are also changing rapidly, just for very different reasons. So we need to come to expect and prepare for this responding to change on a regular basis. And this experience has helped me to reframe so that responding to change in those experiences isn't seen as a failure in planning. And as a result of spending those 6 extra days in Antarctica with no control over how long it lasted, I definitely left with much more empathy for when people are in those moments, struggling with dynamic situations and adapting to the change. Because ultimately it's people. People are the ones who are experiencing change. It's not just a process that we're rolling out, but people are the ones who are experiencing it. And so we need to remember that and control the things that we can control, like the communication and the expectation setting, because they make a big difference. So that is my 6th and final takeaway, which is to keep empathy at the forefront. So I have a final exercise, a little self-reflection that I would just encourage all of us to participate in, which is really just to think about, how these non-work, non-software examples can help us relate to challenges that our teams do face, right? Wouldn't necessarily think an Antarctic trip relates that much to my day-to-day work, but I found that it really did. So I wonder, what you might think about how similar experiences of yours could help you relate to the challenges your team face, how we can take these lessons and apply them to our work, and ultimately, how the last year has helped you in responding to change in work, and also, in reflecting on the importance of empathy. So it is totally optional if you want to share any of your reflections on this, but if you do, then I'm going to ask you to focus on the last question. We can go back to the Menti. So again, it's www.menti.com. 949310 is the code. And if you do, just focus on the last question about what has the last year taught you about responding to change and about the importance of empathy, since we've all been through quite an experience that has really tested everyone outside of our normal work bounds. I'm just going to go ahead and move that. But again, it's optional. If you want to just take a moment to do some personal self-reflection, that is great as well. If you have any kind of personal aha moments that you would care to share, that in reflecting you think, oh, that might actually be something that I could share back in a team setting as well, that would be great. And this should just be free form. So it could be a phrase, it could be a sentence, whatever makes sense. So thank you for those of you that are sharing. I'm seeing a couple come in. It's been key to reducing division among my relationship connections, adjusting my career path after graduating due to the pandemic. Yes, a sense of purpose helps people remain strong and happy in periods of high uncertainty. Try to be more relaxed about things you can't change. Yeah, be aware that our assumptions about how things work may be open to change. Of course, you can get together with your family. Why wouldn't we go to the office? Yeah, a lot of things that have changed. Know what you really want and who you really want to be around. Patience, respect each other's space, discipline. Always look out for change. Be ready to embrace both internal and external changes. Time management, flexibility helped. A lot of learning, experimenting with virtual get-togethers, better family time, trust people. Physical location doesn't matter. So yeah, I mean, a lot of things that have happened last year that we hadn't maybe experienced before, and maybe elements of them that weren't directly tied to work, but that we could potentially pull into how we do engage. So thank you for everyone who took the time to share. That's really helpful. Okay. All right. I'm just going to wrap up now. So again, just pulling it all together. Here I'm sharing this nice little sketch note that a colleague of mine, Joe Morrison, I want to give a shout out to him. He has really picked up sketch noting and made great strides in it. So he pulled this together for me, but it really does, it pulls all of those takeaways, all 6 of them together for me. And so ultimately what this trip really emphasized for me is why we need planning, and even more importantly, the ability to respond to change. And it was the expedition team's ability to set clear goals while adjusting to new circumstances that protected me and the other passengers from negative outcomes, and at the same time maximized our positive experiences, like getting to see baby penguins, beautiful ice, penguins chilling on that ice, humongous colonies, tens of thousands of those chinstrap penguins, some Weddell seals, some leopard seals, and of course, some of those humpback whales, nice and up close. So that is it. This is all of my info. This is my email. Feel free to connect on LinkedIn. That's my main social media. I have a couple blog links. I will definitely be sharing these slides, and Fadi will have them with the recording as well. So with that, feel free to reach out. I love to connect. And that is all I have. So I'm open to any questions if anyone has any. Thank you so much for your time today.
That was awesome. Thanks, Julie. I hope you were able to go on another trip sometime very, very soon. So I know you're itching.
I hope so as well.
All right. So we have a couple of more minutes for any questions. If anybody has questions for Julie, we're going to go for another 5 minutes or so. All right. I'll jump.
Sure.
Go ahead, Peter.
Not sure if you want me to just jump in or.
Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the things, first of all, Julie, thank you very much for this. One of the things that I've come to believe is that life happens faster than you can plan for it, and so this, reacting to change is really important. One of the things that I was curious about, I heard a lot about the importance of reacting to change. I didn't hear much about iterations and kind of the planning cycle or the planning review cycle that we do. How did any of that kind of enter into how you were doing it? How you were doing this?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I think that's a really good observation. I think it's because in the context of this trip, I was a passenger, so I was experiencing it. I think if you asked the expedition team who was planning the trip, they would probably share their process And I'm sure that they did probably have multiple planning cycles. So obviously, when I'm working with teams, the quick iteration and the quick feedback loops is a really key element, I think, of being able to respond. And I think that's key to the planning cycle, right? Is iterating quickly. But I think that's probably why it didn't show up so much, is because I was on the experiencing side of change. So that is a good observation. Yeah.
Yeah, Julie, I'll jump in here and ask it seemed to me that there was a lot of risk mitigation happening here with multiple plans to follow. Do you recall a situation where the team didn't have a plan and they just came up with one versus going into kind of a list of mitigation aspects that they had already thought of ahead of time?
Sure. Well, I mean, I will say so a lot of things that we did kind of on a normal daily basis of like, oh, we can't land here, we'll try here. Those were kind of normal mitigations, right? They were still on the fallback number 1, fallback number 2, fallback number 3. The fact that we were there for however many days it was, 6 or 7 days longer than planned, that was not something that any of them had experienced before. So at that point, we were in uncharted waters. Them having to decide if we were about to sail this ship back, even though we were supposed to fly back, was not in their normal playbook. So they were sort of at that point on the fly, trying to figure out, okay, how many days is too many? When do we make this call? Who gets to make the final call? It wasn't going to be a vote. That was made clear. It wasn't like the passengers were going to get to vote. So yeah, there was a point at which they were having to figure it out and to chart new plans and read the room a little bit for feedback, but then just make up some of their own plans. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Scott Kirkendall. Hey, this interested me. How do you look at contingency planning versus reacting to change? I mean, obviously you can go too far down the line. We're going to figure out everything we're going to do, whatever happens. On the other hand, if there are risks about that this may happen, sometimes it's useful both letting people know this may happen and then also having a plan in place that you've thought about it ahead of time.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept. And in this example, what I think it draws out to me is somewhat the risk assessment and the risk profile. So like Antarctica is a situation where they know there's a high likelihood of certain events. So in this case, I think you are actually required to have trip insurance to book the trip. And it's because there is a really high likelihood of some events unfolding. And so in this case, again, having trip insurance is an example of planning ahead. So even though, yes, we actually had to rebook our flights probably 10 times, but it didn't end up costing anything because of the planning ahead. So that is a contingency plan that, based on the risk profile, like you should definitely do. But there's other things that would probably be overkill, right? In a different trip, if you're going to drive 30 minutes from your house, you should probably not pack, an extra set of everything that you may need, right? So I think, to your point, like there's probably a risk profile assessment of, how much contingency planning is too much. But yeah. There was one, as a funny aside, there was one couple who had selected this trip as their honeymoon, and I don't think that husband was ever going to be able to live this one down, because it was his choice and not the wife's.
All right, fantastic. On that note, we're going to wrap it up. Thanks a lot, Julie. Awesome of you to come here and share with us your experience. Remember, our next event is going to be on, let me double check here, April 19 at 5:30. This one's going to be an evening event. We're going to have Michael Sahora talk to us about Lost in Translation, the Manager's Role in Agile. All right. So thanks a lot, everybody, for joining, and hope to see you next time. Take care, everybody.